Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about Steam Engine Simulator's new DLC and how it's progressed over the past few months. Before we get started, I'd like to thank BeamNG, Reyna, Meister, and Joe for supporting me at the Master Mechanic level on Patreon, and Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Brilliant.org is a fun and easy way to learn at your own pace, even if you have a busy schedule. Brilliant offers a wide variety of amazing interactive courses which will seriously help you professionally and when working on your own side projects. Brilliant's courses have meaningful practice problems, so you can put what you learn into practice immediately. I myself have taken quite a few of these courses and found them to be really engaging and well put together. To try all of Brilliant's features for free for 30 days, visit brilliant.org/ontothegreat or click on the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Once again, thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Steam Engine Simulator is a mini-game that I released that was supposed to be kind of a joke, but very quickly went semi-viral on Steam, reaching 90,000 downloads in 1 month. Today, it's sitting at over 250,000 downloads. The game, if you even want to call it that, is incredibly simple in appearance and lacks any real gameplay elements. It's literally just a simulation of a steam engine, and the only load that you can apply to the engine is the engine's brake, which isn't that interesting. So many people suggested adding DLCs, where the user can use the steam engine to do useful work. This is exactly what we're going to be building today, specifically a DLC which allows the user to power a city. The project officially began in July of 2023. I was busy working on Engine Simulator at the time, so I brought on a new developer who goes by Hjorgen to help me put together the initial prototype. The original plan was fairly simple. A generator was needed and something for it to power, like a city that maybe grows over time. By October, Hjorgen's prototype was complete, and we did some testing with a small group of Patreon members. I worked with Hjorgen on the prototype for a few weeks in October, adding some new assets like this procedurally generated belt and this energy demand graph. I figured also that the city could make for an interesting centerpiece for the game, and I created this mock-up in Blender of how it might work. It was pretty difficult to work this into the 2D blueprint aesthetic of the game, but I think it worked surprisingly well in the end. At this point, development was going completely according to schedule. When the Steam page was first established in July, the planned release date was listed as December, but this was not announced publicly. At the time, I thought this was an extremely safe release date to set since the base game was completed in just a few days and performed pretty well on Steam, so 6 months seemed like more than enough time. Well, clearly this was not the case, so what happened? Just to be clear, the DLC absolutely could have been released in December, as planned. As of December 1st, it looked like this, and it seems that all of the major components are there, and it wouldn't have taken much effort to get the DLC released, but ultimately I decided against it. And the reason is, honestly, the game was just not very good. It was clear that the testers weren't that engaged, the game lacked any kind of real progression, didn't have much of a personality to it, and I just didn't feel that the quality level lived up to what people were likely expecting from the product. The other major issue is that I was planning to sell this DLC for money. That was always the plan from the beginning, and even though the sale price would be low, definitely under $5, charging any amount of money immediately raises people's expectations for a product. So I decided to delay the release, and while I did get a few angry messages on Discord and Steam, I think it was ultimately the right decision. Alright, with all that being said, the first thing that needed to be done was a complete overhaul of the base game. I covered a lot of these improvements in my last video, so I won't cover them in too much detail today. A lot of these changes were also written with the intention of reusing the code in Engine Simulator later, since both projects share a very similar framework. The end result was a much better organized and stable platform where it'll be easy to add DLCs in the future. Depending on player interest, this could include more complex engines, loads, and minigames that use engine upgrading as a mechanic, which has been requested quite a bit. Besides these important architectural changes, simple things like pausing, auto-saving, and a main menu were added to make the game feel a bit more professional. The absence of these features was probably acceptable in the original game since it was free and clearly a casual minigame, but I don't think it would be acceptable in a paid product. For most of December and part of January, the game was in a pretty incomprehensible state while I focused on restructuring and rewriting the game's code. Once all the pieces were put back together, it was time to figure out how to fix the DLC itself. This was an interesting exercise for me because I don't have that much experience making actual games and designing engaging game mechanics. I determined that the most important thing to do was identify the core concept of the game. To me, it is about efficiency, or specifically the player's ability to operate the engine efficiently and in a controlled manner. The next task was to determine how to structure an interesting game loop around this core concept of engine efficiency. In other words, we need some sort of goal for the player to achieve. Growing the city as much as possible seems like a logical goal, but if you think about it, this doesn't actually have much to do with engine efficiency. The DLC was already structured around this implicit goal of growing the city, but as the game progressed, operating the engine efficiently actually became less important, and the player spent more time just waiting for the city's population to increase, which isn't that interesting. After thinking for a while and taking some inspiration from real economic principles, I settled on the following game mechanics. The player can spend money on the following things: fuel to run the steam engine and generate electricity, the construction of buildings in the city, which increases the city's population capacity, building upgrades, which increase profit margins, and maintaining their infrastructure, like buying cables, for example. Electricity is sold to the residents at a rate set by the player, and I think this is the most critical mechanic. Cheaper electricity will attract more residents to the city, while expensive electricity will drive residents away. Residents are also driven away by poor service, like outages or power surges. There are also some emergent mechanics that arise from the simulation itself, the main one being that power generation is less efficient when generating less energy. This is because when demand is low, the frictional losses and other parasitic losses in the engine are large compared to the energy output of the system. This plays very well with our other mechanics because it creates a logical progression to the game. At first, it's very difficult to generate electricity efficiently because you're just not generating that much, and so you'll need to set your electricity price fairly high to cover your costs. As your city grows, you can gradually lower the price and adjust your operating style to maximize efficiency, and the more efficiently you operate, the cheaper you can sell energy and the larger you can grow your city. The final missing piece of the puzzle is to add some story elements to the game. I wrote an entire backstory for Steamtown spanning multiple decades. This backstory will mainly be presented to the player through letters received from various NPCs in the game, which I think will make Steamtown feel like a real place, with real people that have competing interests. From a more practical perspective, these NPCs will give the player tasks, present new challenges, and provide useful information to help the player understand what's going on. I kept this fairly simple to keep the game's complexity from spiraling out of control. I don't want to reveal too much about this story because I want players to experience it for themselves in the game. I'm not going too crazy with this. There won't be cutscenes or voice acting or anything like that. It's just to add a bit of personality to Steamtown and a convenient way of giving hints and tasks to the player. To make room for the new elements required to implement this new game concept, I restructured the layout to make better use of the space that was available. It looks terrible right now because none of the assets match their new positions, but this will be fixed later. The control panel on the left shows the player some important high-level information. Just as before, the player can click empty plots to build new buildings and click on existing buildings to upgrade them. The player is shown how efficiently they're operating with this value, showing fuel cost per kilowatt hour generated. The mailbox, which is empty right now, will be where the player will receive letters from the game's NPCs. Over the next few days, I implemented the city's growth model. This had to be carefully designed to keep the game balanced all the way from the early to late game stages. I spent quite a bit of time studying the Steam engine's performance characteristics and designing a city simulation that would work well with the properties of the Steam engine to keep the game challenging. With that added, all that was really left was cleaning up this interface. I added numbers and lines to the energy demand graph and this sky backdrop to the city, which also changes depending on the season. There's nothing too complicated there, just a smooth interpolation between different colors depending on the time of day and the season. I then cleaned up some of the temporary assets in the Steam engine itself. A lot of people noticed the secondary needles on the temperature gauge and engine speed gauge. Those were always temporary, and it was finally time to replace them with dedicated assets. First, I added a new gauge for the steam temperature. I then added a new element to represent the estimated power band on the engine's speed gauge. This is calculated based on the current boiler temperature and pressure using an analytical model. I replaced this temporary generator RPM gauge with a finalized version with a bit more information on it. A lot of people have commented that the generator RPM is wrong, but it actually isn't. 3200 RPM seems correct because it translates to a rotational speed of 60 Hz, but the frequency of the electricity generated by an alternator also depends on the number of poles the alternator has. This is a 12-pole alternator design, which means that it needs to spin at 600 RPM to generate electricity at 60 Hz. Finally, I spent a bit of time adding some personality to the Steamtown visualizer. I was trying to go for a postcard aesthetic, but this is not finalized yet, and I have some more ideas that I want to try. At this point, we are only missing a small gauge cluster in the lower right corner, and the mailbox feature, and the DLC will be ready for release. I'll probably post one more video about this after the official release so we can review the sales numbers together and feedback from the community. After that, I'll return to full-time engine simulator development so we can start putting the pieces together and moving towards a minimum viable product. If you're interested in more detailed updates about what I'm working on, I suggest checking out my second channel. The link for that is in the description. Once again, thanks to all my supporters on Patreon and Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.